Welcome to Dialogue. This deep dive is part of our continuing series on dirty politics, where we explore real-world, documented examples of political maneuvering.
Today, we turn our attention to Case 8, the infamous Brooks Brothers Riot.
And this is a fascinating one. We're diving into a case that really isn't about the usual backroom deals or financial scandals. This one is about public, visible, and organized chaos, a disruption that was ironically defined by its wardrobe.
Exactly.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to extract the key lessons about how a political campaign can deploy manufactured disorder, how they can use it as a tool to halt or really delegitimize democratic processes when those processes just aren't going their way.
And this case is just a perfect laboratory for understanding that. It's where we see the strategy of what you could call protest as pressure really come into its own.
Protest is pressure. I like that.
The whole strategy shifts. It's no longer about trying to win the legal argument or the moral high ground. It becomes about creating this overwhelming, optics-driven influence that just forces a premature end to the whole thing.
And what's so wild about this case is that the dirty politics here wasn't messy in the way you'd think. It wasn't chaotic.
It was meticulously organized. It was professional. It shows how the appearance of an aggressive mob can be strategically cast and deployed to hit a very specific, vulnerable target.
Right. The administrative machinery of an election. Okay, so let's set the stage. To understand this, we have to go back to Florida in the year 2000. The stakes couldn't have been higher.
No, the environment was just utterly combustible. The entire 2000 U.S. presidential election came down to a single state.
To Florida.
To Florida. Because of the Electoral College, this wasn't just some close state race. This was it. This was for the whole presidency.
And the margin of victory. This is the crucial point for the whole story, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was practically non-existent.
Statistically invisible. When the first count was done, the margin separating George W. Bush and Al Gore was just a few hundred votes. A handful.
Which, in a state the size of Florida, is.
It's a rounding error. Because it was so close, it legally triggered a mandatory statewide recount. This wasn't a choice. Florida law required it.
So the highest office in the world is hanging on a manual review of paper ballots in a few Florida counties.
Exactly. And that legal uncertainty just escalated so fast, it eventually ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court. Every single ballot, every delay, every hour became a pressure point in this massive geopolitical game.
Okay, so let's talk about the process itself, because you mentioned the process was the target. Specifically, the manual recount in Miami-Dade County. This is where we get the infamous hang-in chads.
That's it. The manual recount was slow, it was frustrating, and critically, it was subjective. You had election officials, many of them volunteers, literally holding up these punch card ballots to the light.
Trying to figure out what the voter intended.
Right. Was the little piece of paper, the chat, was it hanging? Was it just dimpled? Was it punched all the way through? This was painstaking work that required intense concentration. It needed a calm, quiet, administrative environment.
And that process, which the courts had said should continue, that became the enemy for one side.
It became the primary obstacle. And this brings up a fundamental question in this whole field.
Which is?
When the legal process itself is favoring your opponent, and the law is literally saying, keep counting, what do you do? Where does your political leverage come from?
You can't fight it in the courts anymore, so.
So you make the process impossible to complete. The core idea is that dirty politics targets the process when the law isn't on your side. You don't try to change the law. You create such intense external pressure, physical, political pressure, that the officials themselves are forced to stop. The recount was the target. Stopping it was the mission.
So you're not changing the rules of the game, you're just knocking over the game board. You run out the clock by creating total chaos.
Precisely. If that slow, meticulous recount is allowed to finish, the result is legitimized, no matter how narrow the margin. But if the process is stopped early, under this cloud of physical threat and mayhem, then the whole thing looks illegitimate. And you can force the issue back into the courts on a timeline that's more favorable to you.
That makes sense. Let's move to the incident itself then. November 22, 2000, Miami-Dade County Election Office. Paint us a picture of what that room was like before the disruption.
Before, it was pure bureaucracy. Think long tables, stacks of ballots, officials leaning over them, supervisors conferring. It was tedious, quiet work. Vital for democracy, but completely undramatic.
And then that just shatters.
Instantly. A group of individuals descends on the administrative headquarters, and they are specifically targeting the rooms where the counting is taking place.
And this wasn't a peaceful protest outside with signs. This was active, aggressive interference right where the work was happening.
Oh, absolutely. The accounts describe extreme physical disruption, aggressive shouting right in the faces of the election officials who are trying to examine ballots.
Just pure intimidation.
And noise. Loud, persistent banging on the doors, on the thin office walls, just creating this deafening racket designed to completely destroy the concentration needed for that kind of work. They literally cornered staff members.
I can't imagine. Going from this quiet, tedious task to suddenly facing a hostile, screaming crowd. For these civil servants, it must have been terrifying.
It was designed to be terrifying. That was the point. The whole goal was to create this undeniable sense of physical disorder and threat inside an administrative space.
These aren't riot police.
Not at all. These are, middle-aged county employees and local volunteers. They're trained to count ballots, not manage a mob. The chaos just completely overwhelmed them.
And the impact was immediate.
Yeah.
And devastatingly effective.
It achieved the political objective almost instantly. Within just a few hours of the protest hitting its peak, the Miami-Dade County Canvassing Board voted to halt the manual recount indefinitely. They cited the hostile environment, the impossibility of doing sensitive work under that kind of duress. The physical actions of that crowd directly led to stopping the count.
Which was the entire goal.
The entire goal.
Okay, now we have to get to the detail that gives this whole thing its name. The Brooks Brothers Riot. This is what makes it so unique.
It's just perfect irony, isn't it? It's the centerpiece of the whole optics strategy.
Right, because when you think riot, you picture something very different.
You picture angry citizens in jeans and T-shirts, maybe activists. But these protesters were the exact opposite. They were famously well-dressed.
Corporate-looking.
That's the word everyone used. Corporate-looking. They were in business suits, many of them expensive. Silk ties, polished shoes. The brand that got mentioned over and over in reports was Brooks Brothers, which is, a symbol of the corporate establishment.
So you have a physical, aggressive, intimidating riot. But it's happening in business casual. It just completely flips the script on what political disruption is supposed to look like.
It does. And that's why the name stuck. The professional look immediately suggests organization, coordination, a link to established power.
Which is such a sharp contrast with what they were actually doing.
Shouting, banging on walls, actively sabotaging a civic function. They were performing outrage while wearing the uniform of the establishment.
And that uniform is a clue, which brings us to our next section. Because this whole thing just dispels any idea that this was spontaneous.
This is the core of it. This was not some organic, local outrage that just boiled over. This was a carefully orchestrated, organized deployment of political assets.
So they weren't just local Republican volunteers who happened to have nice suits.
Not even close. Later reporting journalists who dug into travel records, expense reports, political affiliations, they identified many of the key players. A huge number of the core disruptors were high-level political operatives, campaign professionals, and critically, Republican congressional staffers from Washington, D.C.
Wow. So these are people whose day job is policy and political strategy.
These are professionally trained political combatants, and they were flown into this very vulnerable administrative center and briefed on exactly how to apply pressure.
You don't just accidentally fly in a dozen congressional aides from D.C. for a heartfelt demonstration.
No, you fly them in for a surgical targeted mission, a mission designed to achieve a specific operational outcome on a very tight timeline. This was an operation.
So this gives us the first really big lesson from the Brooks Brothers riot. If you can't win the process, your new goal is just to delegitimize it.
Or stop it altogether.
Yeah.
That is the essential insight. The objective was not to persuade the canvassing board that the recount was legally flawed. The goal was to apply massive visible leverage by making the counting environment physically impossible.
And having these recognizable political pros in the crowd actually added weight to the chaos.
It did. It sent a signal to the media and to higher political powers that this wasn't just some local squabble. This was a national crisis that required an immediate shutdown.
They turned a boring civic duty into a political cage match. They used organized aggression to get a political win they couldn't get through legal means.
That's it in a nutshell.
So let's really break down why this worked so fast and so well. It seems to highlight a major vulnerability in our whole election system.
It absolutely does. And the success comes down entirely to the vulnerability of the people involved. Think about where this happened. A standard county government building.
Low security.
Very low security. Staffed by professionals who are focused on administration, on clerical work. They are completely unprepared, psychologically and structurally, for a physical confrontation.
They're there to count ballots, not to fend off a mob, no matter how well-dressed that mob is. Facing that kind of aggression must have created genuine fear for their personal safety.
Of course. The intimidation was the mechanism. When your workspace transforms from an office into a place where you feel physically threatened, the human response is to stop. You prioritize safety. That painstaking manual recount requires quiet focus.
And that focus was destroyed.
Instantly and irrevocably.
Which brings us to the media. The minute the cameras show up and see this scene, the suits, the shouting, the chaos, how does that coverage play into the success of the tactic?
The media coverage provides the essential political cover for stopping the count. The story that gets broadcast to the public is not, lawyers are arguing over ballot detail.
It's chaos in Florida.
Precisely. Chaos and disorder engulf the electoral process. It frames the situation as an out-of-control crisis. And once it's a crisis, the legal merits of the recount become secondary. The narrative becomes about restoring order.
So the optics of the protest became more powerful than the actual democratic principle of counting the votes. The perception of instability gave them the justification they needed to halt.
Correct. Stopping the count just because your side is losing looks terrible. It looks anti-democratic.
Right.
But if the officials say they had to stop because the facility was under siege by an aggressive crowd...
It becomes a necessary security measure.
Exactly. The political operation successfully manufactured the visual justification they needed to get the outcome they wanted.
And this gets to the strategic genius of it, operating just below the criminal threshold.
This is maybe the most important tactical detail of the whole event. This was calibrated aggression. The protesters were intimidating, they were disruptive, but they deliberately stayed just below the line that would trigger mass arrest and felony charges.
They committed political sabotage without giving the media the easy headline of political extremists arrested for assault.
That's it. Dirty politics thrives in that gray zone. Below the criminal threshold, but way, way above the ethical one. If they had been overtly violent, the story would have flipped against them immediately.
But by staying technically within the bounds of protest, while being as loud and intimidating as possible, they got their win with minimal legal risk. They didn't need to overthrow the election. They just needed to make the democratic process too uncomfortable to continue.
It's disruption with a resume. A highly focused, professional act of interruption. You don't need to invalidate every vote. You just need to make sure the machine designed to legitimize those votes, the recount, is shut down before it finishes.
Okay, we've established this was a successful, targeted operation.
Yeah.
Now, more than 2 decades later, let's talk about its legacy. Why is this case still so relevant? Why is it a mistake to just dismiss it as some quirky partisan squabble?
It's so easy to fall into that trap, the minimization trap. People look at the Brooks Brothers part and they focus on the humor of the suits.
Right, they see it as a funny anecdote.
And they miss the brutal effectiveness of the tactic itself. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a highly successful field test.
A field test for what?
It was a rehearsal, a beta test for modern political disruption. It created a template that has been replicated many times since. It proved that you can organize spontaneity. It showed how to manufacture a crisis atmosphere using deployed professional personnel.
And it proved that effective political intimidation doesn't actually require overt violence.
Not at all. It just requires highly focused, coordinated aggression aimed right at the soft administrative targets of democracy, the places where the boring, unglamorous, but essential work gets done.
This case really does connect to so many larger patterns we see today.
It does. It's a classic example of using what looks like an authentic, high-energy protest to achieve a very calculated political goal. It laid the groundwork for the strategic amplification of disorder by the media. The cameras focus on the shouting, and the actual democratic principles just fade into the background.
The lesson for political operatives in 2000 was that this is all about leverage. It's not about persuasion. It's about using the image of disorder to force the outcome you want.
And because it worked so well in 2000, the strategy became normalized. The idea of protest as pressure is now a standard tool in the political playbook. Crowds are understood as tools for political theater.
Not just to express an opinion.
But to apply targeted, often physical pressure on government functions, on election officials, on legislative bodies, the optics have become the weapon.
A weapon that can often be more powerful than facts or legal arguments. The Brooks Brothers Riot was just an early, very successful demonstration of that weaponized spectacle.
I think the essential takeaway here is a very pragmatic, and maybe a very cynical one. You don't have to go through the massive risk and effort of actually falsifying votes to shape an election's outcome. You just have to make the mundane, essential process of counting those votes feel dangerous or illegitimate or just too chaotic to handle. If you can stop the process before it finishes, you win. The sabotage succeeds because the democratic function failed to survive long enough to do its job.
A strategic failure engineered through theatrical, tailored disruption. An incredibly effective, organized, and deeply cynical piece of political theater that is still teaching us lessons today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.